Bojowa maszyna podдержки танков. Combat vehicle for supporting tanks. Or less literally, a tank support combat vehicle. Quite a simple and understandable name. However, due to starting with BMP, the vast majority of people associated with infantry fighting vehicles of Soviet and post-Soviet origin. This, as many other features this peculiar vehicle has in stock, like the very IVLIYEV weapon system, composed of 30mm autocannons and ATGMs, results in a common misconception of it being an infantry support vehicle, which, as the name suggests, is not really the case. BMPT Terminator exists to fight infantry, mobile AT teams, light or heavy IFVs, or as it is often written and said broadly in sources, enemy forces which pose a threat to the tank. Its whole existence came from this simple line of thought, which as an idea existed for far longer than Soviet and then Russian designed vehicles under this name. But it has to be said, initially, the engineers working on the concept thought about the BMPT indeed being a heavy IFV platform, which would be able to not only support the tanks, but also deploy infantry for further support. This, however, did not come to fruition, and the idea of a vehicle without dismounts came out on top, as shown by GSK B2 CZZ 700 series designs, and ultimately with Product 199 Ramka, developed by UK BTM under the Ramka 99 Research and Development Project. In this video, I will aim to clear up what BMPT is, how the design changed over time, and how in the end, UK BTM team under one Alexander Yakovlev, former lead designer of the Ramka 99 R&D, developed a vehicle which did not conform to the technical specification given out by main Automotive Armored Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, hereinafter referred to as GAP2, for a tank support combat vehicle, the main task of which was to combat threats to the tank, but instead focused initially on a vehicle with long arms and keen eyes, as Yakovlev has put it. Let's start from the beginning. Where did the name BMPT and its tank support meaning even come from? The term itself was coined in the mid-1980s by Vasily Ivanovich Petrov, Deputy Minister of Defense, Marshal of the Soviet Union, and Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Ground Forces. Petrov was described as a decisive man with, quote, to put it lightly, unconventional approach. When it came to new armored fighting vehicle designs, he heavily emphasized the need for good armor protection, and as one anecdote states, during his visit at Kurgan-Mazh-Zavod, which at the time was working on a new experimental IFV which would become the BMP-3, he asked about its protection against shape-charged warheads. Chief designer at KMZ, Alexander Alexandrovich Blagonravov, responded that the armor could be penetrated by such threats. Petrov immediately retorted that if that's the case, such a vehicle is not needed. We can only speculate if he changed his mind down the line or was outvoted on the issue, as the vehicle was in the end adopted as BMP-3 in 1987. One could argue that his enthusiasm for heavily armored IFVs wasn't broadly shared in late Soviet Union. But it is known that going as far back as to 1960s, the designers around the USSR were thinking about a heavily armored infantry fighting vehicle. Which is quite understandable, as studies have shown that mass-employed anti-tank weapons could make up to 80% of targets of the attacking force, and their density could reach 30 to 40 units per 1 kilometer of the front. In such conditions, usage of the lightly armored IFVs and APCs at the spearhead was too risky, so they had to operate behind the tanks, which, considering their armament specialized against other AFVs and strongpoints, didn't perform well against plentiful soft targets all around. Solution to this problem was supposed to be the initial BMP-T, a tank chassis-based IFV, which had following main goals to achieve. Armor no worse than the contemporary MBT it would be operating with, protecting the current dismounts from small caliber shells and artillery fragments. It had to have the ability to simultaneously suppress and destroy several targets, so-called multi-channel targeting. It had to ensure continuous all-around observation of the battlefield during day and night by employing multi-channel sighting. Mobility had to be at the level of the contemporary MBT. modular design of weapon systems, and the possibility of replacing them with structurally new or modernized ones. Maximum possible operational and production unification with tanks in service or in the R&D stage. The initial idea Petrov was approached with in 1985 by Major General Oleg Nikitich Brylev, who was the initiator of the R&D work on the topic and head of the tank department at the Military Academy of Armed Forces of the USSR, and Marshal Oleg Alexandrovich Losik, head of said academy, was one for such a heavy infantry fighting vehicle based on a unified tank chassis, an idea which he was very much in favor of, and which he accepted and given a name of BMPT. A name which, admittedly, initially did not match the still very much IVLIYEV concept with dismounts on board present. But as we know, as the time went on, BMPT lost the infantry component and became purely a combat vehicle with no transport functionality. By the resolution of the Council of Ministers of USSR of June 19, 1986, BMPT was included in the 5-year plan for the most important experimental design and research work on weapons and military equipment for years 1986 to 1990. The work done by O.N. Brylev's tank department on the concept of its use and the operational tactical justification for its application gave it a proper foundation. And the name itself, one could argue, steered the entire project in a specific, dismountless direction. The contract for development of the vehicle was given to Chelyabinsk Tractile Plant Design Bureau of the Ministry of Agriculture GSKB2 CTZ, led by Valery Leonidovich Vershinsky. KBP Tula, under Arkady Georgievich Shipunov, was co-contracted for the project as the design team of the weapon system. BMPT's conceptual and operational design, alongside the justification of the idea, including combined arms deployment in tank or motorized rifle units, combat effectiveness simulations, and testing of prototypes, were carried out by the 38th Research Institute of the Ministry of Defense in Kubinka, with the participation of Mobile Vehicle Engineering Institute Vny Transmash and the Tank Department of the Military Academy of Armed Forces of the USSR. GSKB2 CTZ started work on their BMPT design as early as 1985, according to some sources, meaning they have started their work before funding was guaranteed. During that time, the work was done jointly in cooperation with the tank department of the Academy under Brylev and Safonov. It was designed as a vehicle which would operate jointly with tank or otherwise mechanized forces and be tasked with eliminating enemy forces which posed a threat to the tank or other vehicles. This line of thought came directly from the Soviet experiences in Afghanistan during that time, where the hard mountainous terrain, with vast differences in elevation, heavily restricted the use of main battle tanks' primary weaponry due to insufficient elevation angles, which limited cases in which deployed tanks could effectively engage Mujahideen forces and relegated them mostly to a psychological weapon role. In clutch came the BMP-2 with its 2A42 30mm autocannon, which possessed max elevation of 75 degrees. Originally envisioned as a capability to fire at low-flying aircraft and helicopters, in the harsh mountainous terrain, it allowed the BMPs to engage enemy combatants located above the roads, which typically led through valleys. Due to the specifics of warfare during the invasion, Soviet forces started employing modified ZSU-23-4 Shilka self-propelled anti-air guns for anti-infantry duty and escorting of convoys. In some cases, removing the radars, which due to Mujahideen forces' lack of aircraft were largely useless, up-armoring them and increasing the ammo load. The system's usage was effective, but as can be figured from what I just said, light armor on Shilka, and to a similar extent on BMP-2, meant that they weren't able to take hits. Mujahideen were known for proficient use of contemporary anti-tank weapon systems, and as such, it posed a considerable problem, just as various engineers had foreseen in the USSR. A heavy vehicle suited to fighting in such terrain was needed, a so-called mountain tank. BMPT was meant to be a solution. By combining the tank's ability to take hits with more flexible weapon systems meant to engage lighter targets like infantry more effectively, as tanks suffered from relative lack of flexibility in this matter, not only because of the already mentioned elevation angles, but also due to lack of secondary or tertiary armament, which would allow for safe engagement of other threats at the same time when primary armament engaged someone else. Utilizing the hatch-mounted MG meant for anti-air duty was risky and cumbersome. This issue in lesser part applied to BMP-2s and Shilkas, as they also lacked secondary armament independent from their main guns. There were attempts by crews to alleviate it by mounting machine guns or even automatic grenade launchers on their vehicles, but they suffered the same problem as the hatch-mounted MGs on tanks, having to be outside the armor. Of course, thanks to the autocannons as their primary weapon system, they could more effectively engage moving groups of infantry and switch targets, but as I said, to a lesser extent, the problem still applied. The fix, on paper, was rather straightforward. Add the additional armament in remotely controlled weapon stations, be it casemated ones with fixed arcs of fire, or fully traversable ones. Pair it with tank-like armor and in theory you get an ideal system. However, execution of such an idea was rather hard in practice. Utilizing more weapons required more crewmen. More crewmen required more space. More space means more volume to armor, which means more armor is needed to cover it, which results in higher weight and needed extensive modifications to the unified chassis, which raises costs and so on. With the initial proposal for BMPT to be more of a heavy infantry fighting vehicle, the crew size issue wouldn't have been as big of a problem, as some of the weapons could have been utilized by the motorized infantrymen on board, and the crew proper could remain at a tank level of 3 people, that is, commander, driver, and the gunner. All that thought for later. Initial design at GSKB2 went under such on paper simple and straightforward requirements. As said by one of the veterans of the design bureau, Chief Designer Vershinsky tasked his engineers with following, to quote, "Create a combat vehicle as protected as a tank, armed with powerful automatic weaponry, which could be deployed alongside the tank, and perhaps even in front of it. Then, it would destroy enemy infantry, which is dangerous to tanks, both in front of the tank and on the flanks, giving the tank the opportunity to destroy worthy targets, anti-tank guns, missile systems, and other enemy tanks." With this seemingly simple, yet in practice rather lofty design criteria, work began. Base platform for unification was chosen. It would be the Uralvakonzavod's T-72 tank, which hull was going to be extensively redesigned to fill its new role, but retain the most important components for ease of logistics. Crew would compose of quite ridiculous 7 people, none of which would be dismounts in the classic sense, mind you. However, an idea that the secondary and tertiary weapon operators could be used to perform dismounted operations was floated up until the crew reduction to 5, and even before it, the idea, as becomes kind of a theme with this vehicle, was rather lofty, as there was no safe way for these crewmen to exit the vehicle in combat. The crew would be arranged as follows: 3 people in front of the vehicle, driver in the middle, and 2 automatic grenade launcher operators flanking him on each side. Commander and the gunner would be sitting inside the primary compartment in the middle, where main armament would be located. At this point, the design of the weapon system wasn't clear, so there is no mention of them sitting in a turret. Behind them, 2 machine gunners would cover the sides and rear of the vehicle. While the coverage of weapons of such a system would be quite impressive, one has to ask if at a certain point the designers remembered how tanks initially looked during the Great War, especially with something like the A7V. Using more soldiers than 2 contemporary Soviet MBTs isn't exactly the most optimal solution, as with only 3 BMPTs of such design, you would have enough soldiers to man 7 tanks. Nonetheless, such design parameters were set, and first prototypes were soon built. They were built in 2 armament configurations known as A and B. Okay, if we are to be specific, there were technically 3 armament configurations, as 2 variants of the A configurations were built, with some changes between them. These A and B variants were known under the designation Object 781 SB7 and SB8 respectively, sometimes referred to as Object 781 and Object 782, but that is incorrect, as Object 782 was a never realized BMPT project on the base of promising Object 187 tank codenamed Ramka. This Soviet Ramka was to be armed with a 100mm 2A70 low-pressure gun, which leads some to believe 782 was built, as they confuse it with Object 781 SB8. But as the USSR collapsed, it never had a chance to be built. Such was the sad fate of the original Ramka project under GSKB2. Object 781 SB7 had the A armament configuration, which consisted of two unmanned turret systems mounted side by side, each armed with a braced 2A72 30mm autocannon and a 7.62mm PKT machine gun. The left turret had smoke grenade launchers, the right one was armed with Concourse ATGM launcher with 2 missiles in the launcher and 4 missiles in reserve. Secondary armament composed of two casemate-mounted AG-17 30mm automatic grenade launchers located on the sponsons. Tertiary armament would be two PKT machine guns in the rear, one in a small turret able to cover the sides and rear of the vehicle. SB7 had a second configuration. It retained same primary armament with two independent turrets, but changed the secondary armament of the hull. It had only one AG-17 automatic grenade launcher, also in a casemate as the first configuration, located on the right sponson. But the left sponson sported a small remotely controlled weapons station with a single PKT machine gun. The rear weapons configuration remained the same. Object 781 SB8 had the B armament configuration. Only one prototype was built. Its primary armament was located in one low-profile centrally mounted turret with a weapon system identical to one from BMP-3. A 100mm low-pressure 2A70 gun with Bastion ATGM system sporting 4 missiles and with permanently affixed 2A72 30mm autocannon in a brace on its right side. Additionally, the turret had an unspecified caliber automatic grenade launcher, most likely also a 30mm AG-17. And for the commander, a separate remotely controlled weapon station with a PKT machine gun was integrated into his hatch. The hull mostly matched the first A configuration's armament, with two casemate-mounted AG-17 automatic grenade launchers in the front, but due to usage of a bigger weapon system in the larger turret, there was no space for the remotely controlled weapon station with the PKT machine gun behind it. To alleviate this, two side-mounted PKTs were included, which could cover the sides of the vehicle, but not the rear, due to the way they were mounted. In May 1987, by order of Army General Dmitry Yazov, whom in May of that year also became the Defense Minister of the USSR, these prototypes, before any testing has occurred, were transported to a Labino proving ground under Moscow to be showcased to the USSR's army leadership. The vehicles sparked a lot of attention, and immediately after returning from the Labino exhibition, were finally sent to the Chelyabinsk district testing ground Treburkel in Nepryakino, where testing occurred. 38th Research Institute staff oversaw them. Then Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Ground Forces for Armament and Chief of Armament of the Ground Forces, Sergei Alexandrovich Mayev, was also present and is said to have liked the Chetezat vehicles. After the testing cycle was concluded, Configuration A vehicle Object 781 SB7 with two separate unmanned turret systems was chosen. KBP Design Bureau Director A.G. Shipunov, according to KBP veterans' anecdotes, disliked this vehicle and this decision. He supposedly wrote his conclusion on the vehicle on the final sketch of the SB7 and signed it. What he wrote exactly remains unknown. With Configuration A chosen and cleared for production, GSK-B2 was readying up for initial pilot batch of the pre-serial vehicle, finalizing blueprints and production schedules. But it wasn't meant to be. 1990s came. A new decade and a so-called Black Year. Testing of the vehicles, project work, and entire military-related development at GSK-B2 Chetezat was ordered to cease. Documentation was ordered to be transferred to Uralvagonzavod at once, and soon, in 1991, the Warsaw Pact and USSR at large were on their last legs. ČTZ, however, tried to continue work on their BMPT project despite these perturbations, and on 18th of February 1991, Military Industrial Commission published Decision number 21, which contracted ČTZ to continue work on the experimental research project named RAMKA, and proceed with building the Object 782 prototype on the base of the promising Object 187 tank. This, however, never happened, as on 26th of December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Before said happened though, in July of 1991, an article written by S.A. Gusev in the 7th issue for year 1991 of Vestnik Bronitankowej Techniki, a bulletin of armored vehicles, on the topic of Tank Support Combat Vehicle, the BMPT, was released. In said article, two differing conceptions for what it should be were laid out, numbered 1 and 2. BMPT-1 was a dedicated tank support combat vehicle based on an unchanged T-72B tank chassis, with a brand new low-profile turret with a so-called infantry destruction complex. It was equipped with a 30mm autocannon with 2 PKT machine guns and a dual Concourse ATGM launcher on top, with 2 missiles in the launcher and 4 in stowage. There would also be 2 separate AG-17 automatic grenade launchers in separate turrets flanking the main armament. Such a vehicle promised weight reduction to 38 tons while increasing survivability by significantly reducing its silhouette compared to a standard T-72B tank, thanks to using a low-profile turret which allowed for moving the now 4-man crew completely into the hull. BMPT-1 was more in line with previously accepted BMPT designs, but simplifying them by reducing the hull modification needed and the crew size, which is a running theme with both designs. BMPT-2, however, outlined a more complex idea to return to the heavy IV concept, as Gusev advocated that having a vehicle capable of supporting tanks while sporting a normal-sized crew and motorized infantrymen was a superior choice, as such dismounted force could further enhance the vehicle's ability to eliminate threats to the tank, while also allowing for even more weapon systems to be mounted without the need to balloon the crew size, as they could be operated by said dismounts while mounted. This directly ties to the thought I told you to hold earlier, about normal-sized vehicle crew, as Gusev stated that BMPT-2 could operate with a minimal crew of 3 and 6 dismounts, which was far more sensible than a dedicated 7-man crew. Requirements he presented for BMPT-2 were as follows. 1. It had to have the ability to move under enemy fire in the same battle formation as tanks, that is, to have protection level no worse than that of a tank. 2. It had to have the ability to conduct combat operations and carry out marches together with tanks, that is, to have the same on-road and cross-country mobility as a tank. 3. The crew must have been at least 9 people, commander, driver, and the gunner, and 6 motorized riflemen. Such a unit was deemed to be the smallest effective fighting force in the event of combat operations in a dismounted manner. Active deployment of the dismounted infantry was necessary, with their arcs of fire directed in the direction of the vehicle movement, that is, in the sector where the enemy is most likely to appear. They must have been able to quickly and safely enter and exit the vehicle. The most convenient exit was deemed to be at the rear of the hull. 4. The BMPT-2's armament must have been capable of engaging threats to the tank, such as infantry, anti-tank weapon systems, lightly armored vehicles, low-flying aircraft, and helicopters. This armament may have included an automatic cannon and machine guns against infantry, lightly armored vehicles, low-flying aircraft, and helicopters, automatic grenade launchers for engaging infantry exposed or concealed behind cover or in trenches, and anti-tank guided missiles for combating tanks. And finally, 5. It had to be unified in terms of components with the tank it was based on. This primarily concerned the engine, transmission, and chassis components. Vehicle presented, which mostly adhered to these requirements, was also based on a T-72B tank chassis. But in contrast to BMPT-1, BMPT-2 would have heavily modified. The engine compartment would be relocated to the front, with BKP transmissions still at the rear, connected to it by a central running shaft. The engine itself, to facilitate this setup, would be changed to the new 2V12 X layout engine, which many may know from the fact that its finalized version, 2V12 3A, also known as A85 3A, powers Armata family vehicles, including the heavy infantry fighting vehicle T-15, which thankfully doesn't use a World War II-esque setup with the engine and transmission separated on both ends of the vehicle, but rather uses a modern unified power pack. BMPT-2 as such would have two rear-mounted doors, which would allow safe dismounting of the vehicle even under fire. 4 soldiers would sit directly at the back, while the remaining 2 would flank the driver in front of the vehicle and would be given the task of operating 2 sponson-mounted PKT machine guns in remotely operated turrets. This is the exact same setup that the BMP-3 uses for its dismounts. The idea here was that the 2 soldiers in front could go into the back of the vehicle to dismount via the rear. But I question if such a setup would even be feasible as Gusev portrays it, as even his drawings show that there really wouldn't be enough space for anyone to do such a thing, and both soldiers have their own hatches, same as on BMP-3. Main armament of BMPT-2 would be exactly the same as that of proposed BMPT-1, aside the already mentioned 2 additional PKTs in the hull. This concept of what a tank support combat vehicle could be should be remembered, as with the USSR gone, budget cuts, restructurizations, and changes of priorities occurred. In mid-90s, Chelyabinsk tractor plant CHTZ was restructured into a joint stock company Ural Track. Once the wars in the Caucasus started, some ideas about creation of an anti-terrorist tank started floating around. Ural Track leadership proposed to restart work on the BMPT project on their own without government help. GSKB-2 had to start work from scratch, as the technical documentation was transferred to Ural Vagon Zavod before the USSR collapsed. And so they did. Under A.V. Yermolin, work on the new BMPT began in 1995, with the first prototype ready in 1996. GSKB-2, similarly to other design bureaus at the time, with now plentiful tank chassis all around former Soviet Union available, decided to utilize a pre-existing vehicle as the base for their new BMPT, called Object 787 MBM. That stands for Multipurpose Combat Vehicle. It was nicknamed Gadyuka, which in Russian means Viper. This was caused by a very peculiar armament configuration. The Viper was built upon a T-72 AV tank, whose main armament was removed. The resulting hull was welded up and then up-armored with Contact 1 explosive reactive armor. With the main armament removed, 2 2A72 autocannons in braces, similar to those found on Object 781 SB7, were mounted on both sides of the turret, fed from the big ammo box added at the rear of it. Both cannons were linked together, which meant that they couldn't be aimed individually, contrary to some myths around the topic, which didn't really matter, with both being horizontally aimed by the turret they were mounted on. Next to each cannon, 6 unguided S8 rocket tubes were mounted, for a total of 12. There doesn't seem to be any additional weaponry on the vehicle. However, it has to be noted that some sources say that 2 PKT machine guns and 2 NSV heavy machine guns were also mounted on it. Photographic evidence disproves these claims, but there is a possibility that some modules were removed before the vehicle was transferred to Kubinka. This split weapon arrangement reminded someone at the factory of the Viper's forked tongue, and the name has stuck. The idea behind this vehicle, as with the original BMPT, was to eliminate threats to the tank, so that said tank could operate more freely. 787 itself was, as previous ZZ BMPTs, still called a mountain tank, and just as with previous BMPTs, it was meant to be a vehicle capable of protecting and escorting tanks and other vehicles in heavy mountainous terrain, forested areas, and cities. This is where it is worth to mention that no, BMPT was never meant as some elusive urban warfare extraordinaire, as many would incorrectly lead you to believe. While yes, there was a conscious design effort which took urban warfare into account, it was never the only primary goal, and it being such is simply a myth or lack of knowledge of the people spreading such informations. To facilitate better protection of the converted vehicle against shape-charged warheads, it was comprehensively covered with more Contact 1 area, which resulted in even better coverage than the original T-72AV. Before testing of Object 787 occurred, an important meeting of high-ranking officers and technical research staff of various factories and bureaus occurred on the newly appointed Minister of Defense, General of the Army Igor Nikolaevich Rodionov. One of the attendees was Professor Pavlov, former head of Armament Department at Military Academy of Armed Forces of USSR. He was representing the academy during this meeting. He recounts that during it there were a lot of new officers present, and as it turned out, many, if not most of them, never heard about the BMPT project. Rodionov invited them to inquire about it and say what their impressions of the vehicle are. Some responses were questionable. Officers from Grau started talking that as during World War II, to him, BMPT seemed as a heavy SPG and anti-air gun meant to accompany tanks. A representative of the engineering troops stated that it should be a mine-clearing vehicle, also citing World War II experiences. Only a representative of GAP2 has properly specified that BMPT was a heavily armored vehicle meant to be attached to tank units for tank support and destroying threats to said tanks. Some of the attendees also brought back the idea of BMPT being a heavy infantry fighting vehicle, capable of carrying up to 10 people, probably influenced by the previously mentioned S.A. Gusev article from 1991. The meeting didn't result in any concrete new ideas for the BMPT, and rather showed the opposite, that the somewhat unified vision of what this vehicle was meant to be disappeared alongside the Soviet Union. As the meeting concluded, state plans for research and development projects were adjusted, and GSK B2's BMPT once more had state R&D project status. GAP2 was tasked with overseeing it to its conclusion. On April 5th, 1997, trials of Object 787 were conducted, with presence of 38th Research Institute staff and once again Sergei Alexandrovich Mayev, whom was now Colonel General and Chief of the Main Armament and Technical Directorate of Russian Federation. Him and multiple other high-ranking officers, such as Marshal of the Soviet Union V.G. Kulikov or General of the Army M.M. Zaitsev, advocated for adoption of Object 787. These trials lasted until 10th of April, during which main armament tests were conducted, including realistic engagement scenarios on the move. Only the 30mm autocannons were tested. S-8 rockets were subsequently tested in July of same year. As reported by 38th Research Institute, the cannon performance was quite good. Same, however, couldn't be said about the S-8 rockets, which were deemed ineffective. Other than that, the vehicle was overall praised, and as the story goes, after this wave of success, Uraltrack started advertising, or maybe even gloating about Gadyuka on TV and radio. This has resulted in the army ordering a shutdown of the project on the account of leaking military secrets. Subsequently, it has caused staff changes at the Uraltrack company, and ZTZ going bankrupt in 1998. Object 787 prototype was transferred as previous GSK B2 BMPTs to the Kubinka Tank Museum alongside complete ban on further development of this vehicle by GSKB2. Even before all that happened, Rodionov, who could be considered the father of the final iteration of the BMPT, was dismissed in May of 1997, just after the first trials of Object 787. On 12th of August 1998, GAP2 made the decision that the function of the lead contractor on the BMPT will be transferred to the State Unitary Enterprise UKBTM, and it will undertake development of Product 199 under RAMCA 99 Research and Development Project. The design team at UKBTM under Alexander Yakovlev, who himself was working under chief designer Vladimir Ivanovich Potkin, and later after Potkin's death under chief designer Vladimir Borisovich Domnin, was tasked, as was the theme with previous BMPTs, with designing a vehicle meant to destroy threats to the tank and provide good protection of the crew. While there was a lot of enthusiasm with the latter, the former was largely ignored according to Yakovlev, who described the vehicle as a sledgehammer that, accordingly, the Russian military wanted. A vehicle meant to drive into ambush, take hits, and so to say hit the nails on their heads, which to me, as a side note, is a very sensible idea when you want a vehicle that is meant to escort tanks, convoys, IVs, or whatever you prefer, and provide overwhelming firepower meant to eliminate threats that a normal tank would be disadvantaged against. Yakovlev straight up says during an interview that his design team largely ignored what the Russian military wanted and focused on creating a sniper tank, a vehicle meant to fight from cover, a vehicle meant for ambushing. To quote him, the RAMCA acquired a panoramic sight, excellent Attack-A missiles, and, of course, a unique gunner primary sight. With these elements, the RAMCA acquired the functionality of a very expensive sniper rifle. That is, at a range of up to 10 kilometers, it could hit any armored or slow-moving aerial target. Moreover, because we designed it with remote weapons, even at a range of 3 kilometers, it was impossible to spot it among the bushes. So, after reading our beloved Guderian, who says that a tank should fire from ambush at attacking enemies, we optimized the RAMCA for this concept, that is, a completely stealthy vehicle, thermal imagers that are completely invisible, a very long arm, and a very keen eye. What the military described in their specification as a tank support combat vehicle was practically never developed. We took the sin upon ourselves, and instead of making a simple sledgehammer, we made a microscope. That's the answer to why the Russian army doesn't have one. The army needs something between a microscope and a sledgehammer for hammering nails. The RAMCA is designed to be sent alongside tanks, destroying anti-tank weapon systems, which is precisely what the military wanted, and which was written into the specifications, but we didn't do that initially. We were building a vehicle with long arms and keen eyes. Moreover, the 2A42 cannon, while we were offered the 2A72 as a newer, more advanced option, we chose the 2A42 because it has a more rigid barrel, and as a sniper rifle, the 2A42 is better as it shoots more accurately. This was the main argument in favor of 2A42. And two cannons means firing at air targets. There's nothing you can do about that. Two cannons, different RAMCAs. What were we hoping for? That we'd make a sniper rifle, that it would be appreciated, that it would be usable, and that the next step would be to make simpler vehicles. If you notice a problem with what was just quoted, you aren't alone. Mr. Yakovlev basically outlines that Product 199 he and his team developed on purpose did not abide by the customer's specification and requirements, with pride claims going with Guderian ideas, which go directly against the whole concept of the BMPT at large, and he provides widely exaggerated information like the 10-kilometer engagement range, which isn't possible for a BMPT, as 9M121, 9M121F, and 1F1 missiles have a max range of 6,000 meters. And the anti-air variant 9M120O, which isn't used by BMPT, has a range of 7,000 meters. same as the 9M120D, widely cited as a missile with 10 km range, which is completely bogus. Knowing that, Yakovlev gloats that they focused on designing a vehicle fighting from ambushes. But if you keen listener might recall, this vehicle was meant to be the one that is ambush. A vehicle which can repel an ambush and protect the convoy it is in while protecting its crew. The Russian military wanted a sledgehammer because that is what they needed, which explains why when the first running model, or more bluntly a mock-up of Ramka, was showcased during Ural Arms Expo 2000 in Nizhny Tagil, which took place between 11th and 14th of July 2000, the customer requested changes to the showcased vehicle, the primary one being that they wanted 2 autocannons, not 1. This is a rather telling sign that the military still wanted a vehicle very much in line with previous work at GSKB-2 in Chelyabinsk, a vehicle aligned in spirit with Object 781 SB7 and Object 787 Gadyuka, of which UKBTM should have knowledge of, as technical documentation was transferred to their parent organization Ural Wagon Zavod, for whom they design vehicles. And indeed, influence from CZZ designs can be clearly seen, especially in the very distinct casemate-mounted automatic grenade launchers mounted in the sponsons, or the use of a low-profile turret which evokes Object 781 SB8 with its low-profile turret. So what was the future-to-be Terminator initially like? It was a vehicle based on a T-72B tank chassis, equipped with a low-profile turret with a single dual-feed 2A42 autocannon with 860 rounds of ammo and a coaxially mounted 30mm AGS-30 automatic grenade launcher with 408 rounds of ammo. On the left side of the turret, a quadruple launcher of Kornet ATGMs was present, and next to the turret's commander hatch, a remotely controlled weapons station equipped with PKT machine gun. This turret was a mock-up, as can be clearly seen on the pictures with sights, sensors, and the ATGM launcher clearly being simplified showcase models. It featured a double sight arrangement, similar to one found on vehicles like the British Warrior IFV, where the gunner and commander had same duplicated sights. These were to be multi-channel day and night sights equipped with thermals, laser rangefinders, and laser designators for guiding the ATGMs. Alongside these, mock-ups of forward-looking laser warning receivers were placed. In the hull, 2 casemate-mounted AG-17A 30mm automatic grenade launchers were located, with a total of 616 rounds of ammunition, 308 for each one. These AGLs were initially aimed using cheap TKN-3 sights mounted in standard T-72 Commander cupolas with removed nut-buoy neutron liner and IR lamps. They could traverse up to 28 degrees outwards and only 6 degrees inwards for a total arc of fire of only 34 degrees, which initially might not sound like a problem, but in a vehicle without neutral steering or good reverse speed, such a limited weapon employment zone is rather questionable. This tank was armored with state-of-the-art Relict ERA, which comprehensively covered the front and sides of the vehicle, while in the back, slat screens were present. The vehicle, however, has a considerable armor flaw. The famous V-driver periscope weak spot was enlarged to the whole upper frontal plate width. This was a necessary step to fit the 2 additional crewmen who operated the AGLs in the sponsons and their hatches. Fuel tanks, which were located in their stations on a normal T-72 or T-90, were moved further back between them and the turret, and were isolated as an additional safety feature. The low-profile turret, uncharacteristically for such constructions, still featured a rather considerable composite armor array in its front. Arguably, this mock-up showed more promise than the reworked vehicle which was showcased in 2002 as a full-on prototype. It was the more sensible configuration, which, aside the questionable double primary sight setup, would simply make for a better and cheaper vehicle. In July 2002, on Russian Arms Expo 2002 in Nizhny Tagil, a full-on prototype was showcased. Finally, as Mr. Yakovlev has described, it featured a panoramic B07K1 sight, also known as Product 7119 or PK7119. It is a single-channel digital TV sight with a laser rangefinder. Contrary to popular belief, this sight doesn't possess a thermal imager and relies on low-light camera mode for night vision, which, while not bad in of itself, is still inferior to even cheapest thermals. BMPT's turret variant that sported a PKP CITV was never built. A proper multi-channel gunner primary sight was mounted on this prototype, known as Product 7121, or a name which might ring more of a bell, Sosna. This sight, as well as B07K1, is still utilized on BMPTs today, even though in 2011 Russian armed forces adopted its improved variant called Sosna U with the T-72B3 tank. From this primary sight, the commander was equipped with a duplicated feed, allowing him access to the onboard thermal imager. The vehicle was equipped with 902A Tuha automatic smoke grenade launcher system, paired with TSU-11 and TSU-111 laser warning receivers, known from the Shtora-1 soft kill active protection system as found on T-90 family tanks. The low-profile turret no longer featured the quadruple cornet ATGM launcher, instead sporting two double Ataka T ATGM launchers. Completely gone was the commander remotely controlled weapon station. The coaxial 30mm AGL was replaced with a second 2A42 30mm autocannon and a top-mounted PKT machine gun with 2000 rounds of ammunition. And here is where a big problem of this design begins. Mounting of two 2A42 autocannons side by side meant that neither cannon was able to utilize its double feed, instead now being limited to single feed operation only, limiting the versatility of the platform. The ammo load itself was reduced from 860 rounds to 850 rounds, which now additionally had to be split between two autocannons. Out of this, common misconceptions arose. First being that one gun is used exclusively with AP ammo and the other with HE ammo. That is only partially correct, as each gun can indeed only use one type of ammo at a time, but both guns can use all ammo types, as it is up to the crew in how they arrange their ammo belts. But it should be noted that by default, if the crew doesn't input the ammo type, Fire Control System selects the left cannon and indexes it as loaded with AP ammo. Second misconception is that the two autocannons are used at the same time for greater firepower. This is simply not possible by how the FCS works. Only one cannon can be fired at a time. The gunner can switch between them freely though, which leads us to the more logical reason for using two autocannons: the ability to limit barrel wear and overheating. This, however, is not really seen in operational service, and most often just one cannon is seen being fired continuously, which goes against proper 2A42 operating instructions, which limit the burst size in high rate mode to 50 rounds continuously, and then 50 rounds in multiple short bursts. After firing of 100 rounds like that, 2A42 has to be left to cool down completely, as to prevent lasting barrel damage. With such setup, BMPT could fire one gun like that, and then switch to the second gun to keep firing in high rate of fire mode. But as mentioned, this doesn't really happen, and these instructions are largely ignored, to huge detriment of this cannon. But this is not the end of the problems. This arrangement, due to the design of 2A42's muzzle brake, results in extreme amounts of wobbling and very poor accuracy with such overheated, worn guns. And to a lesser extent, even when brand new, as the gases from one cannon are vented right into the other, which causes excessive barrel sway, which results in grouping of rounds separated by many meters in most dire scenarios. So much for Mr. Yakovlev's sniper tank. One big change also occurred on the hull side of things. Previous cheap and plentiful T-72 cupolas with TKN free sights were replaced with T-90 style Commander cupolas with Agat MR combined day-night sights. These expensive dual-axis stabilized sights have no place being used for aiming automatic grenade launchers with limited arcs of fire, which are only stabilized in vertical axis. Worth to note that these sights do not possess thermals, only third-generation light intensifiers, which begs the question of why they were used at all. They are so heavily recessed into the whole superstructure and can't really be used for observation aside looking forward, meaning that their big improvements over TKN3 in this role are just wasted. At the same time the sight change occurred, sponson-mounted AGLs were changed to AG-17D model and their ammo was reduced to 600 rounds. This vehicle also got equipped with a GLONASS Navstar navigation system. Two prototypes of this variant were built, with the second prototype being used to test new outer ERA layers, which were used as a basis for further development of the well-known soft-bug anti-tandem ERA, which now also has a normal metal cover. Trials of said vehicles started on 15th of June 2005 and finished on 1st of May 2006, with recommendation for adoption of the vehicle. During the trials, one of the vehicles was used for ballistic testing. It was shot at and used to check the improved mine protection the vehicle was supposed to have. During the armament complex tests, UK BTM veterans Kolmakov and Ustantsiev recall a so-called startle effect, caused by simultaneous engagement of multiple targets at the same time, from which the unofficial, since turned official nickname Terminator arose. And here is a good moment to talk about the multiple target engagement feature and in part just general performance characteristics of BMPT. If you are to put a lot of emphasis on it, the final product 199 Ramka can at best attack 3 targets at once. One target can be engaged with the main weaponry of the turret, and 2 targets in a rather narrow arc in front of the vehicles, each can be engaged with a single automatic grenade launcher. This performance, quite simply, isn't very impressive. No matter how much Evgeny Ivanovich Parafenov, known for the dissertation on defense of the BMPT, says to the contrary and compares it as better than urban warfare modified Western tanks such as M1A2 SEP with Tusk, Leclerc Azur or Leopard 2 PSO. Even goes as far as to specifically mention the mobility aspect of these vehicles and claims BMPT is better than them, which is just flat out incorrect, as all 3 mentioned vehicles are more mobile than BMPT. They possess neutral steering and good backwards mobility, factors which are rather important in tight environments where you don't have space to maneuver, which BMPT distinctly lacks. And not to mention RCWS included in those kits and other improvements. What is even funnier is that some other Russian authors, like Vyacheslav Ivanovich Evdokimov, in Zashita I Bezopasnost, Protection and Security Military Journal, cites BMPT's poor mobility as an issue. But I digress. Let's go back to the multi-targeting abilities. Even the initial Ramka mockup could in theory engage more targets than the final BMPT, as even with its single 2A42 gun, it had a remotely controlled weapons station for the commander, which meant that 1 additional target could be engaged for a total of 4. In fact, it's worth to note that the second gun on the turret of the final BMPT does nothing to improve that, as same as on Object 787, both guns are permanently linked and aimed by the same turret, which means that you can only attack 1 target with them. Kadyuka in fact could only attack 1 target in general, but it gets a pass. Why, you may ask? Because it was cheap, made from a pre-existing T-72AV tank and not just on a basis of a new T-72B or T-90 chassis like the other BMPTs. And also, it had properly braced autocannons which didn't interfere with each other, meaning its accuracy was quite good, contrary to Ramka. When compared to the capabilities shown by Object 781 SB7, which could attack 5 to 6 targets at the same time depending on the configuration, or the theoretical BMPT-2, which could attack 5 targets and then deploy infantry on top of that, the 3 targets look rather unimpressive, especially when we consider that none of the additional armament on BMPT has access to thermal imaging, which helps greatly with targeting not only at night, but during the day, in bad weather conditions, or in cases where the enemy is well camouflaged from the watchful gaze of the IVL Mark I. But there are vehicles in Russian service and in armies around the world which do have that ability. In Russian service, we will single out the T-90M main battle tank with its PKP Commander Independent Thermal Viewer, integrated with a remotely controlled weapon station which sports a cord heavy machine gun. Not only does it sport superior optics and a state-of-the-art thermal imager, the said RCWS can be rotated 360 degrees, meaning that T-90M could, for example, engage two separate targets behind itself, a feat which is unattainable for the Terminator. And at such point, is the ability to engage three targets in a limited arc in front of the vehicle better than being able to engage two targets in whichever direction? Especially when originally accepted BMPT could attack 5 to 6 targets? It's not. In fact, I would go as far as to say that it's a moot point, brought up to defend the rather questionable vehicle that the Product 199 ended up being. And if we look at the history of its procurement, Russian army tends to agree. From the moment it passed the state trials in 2006 to being officially adopted by Russian ground forces, 12 whole years have passed. It was only adopted for service in year 2018, 20 years after the project started, and first delivery of 8 vehicles took place in December of 2020, and were delivered to the 90th Guards Tank Division Vitebsk Novgorod of the Central Military District. Up until the conflict in Ukraine erupted, no more than 2 or 3 dozen of BMPTs were most likely in service, and only recently a new batch was shown being delivered, suggesting rather low priority. Recently leaked documentation suggests that up to 2036, 86 BMPTs would be made and completely overhauled from already existing vehicles, meaning that the total number of them in service could be even lower than that by then, depending on the amount of overhauls. In the sea of critique of this vehicle, one thing can be given to it. Its overall protection level is satisfactory despite the enlarged upper frontal plate weakened area, and if utilized as an ATGM carrier, it can do rather well with its attack at the ATGMs. But that's about it. Otherwise, it is a senseless and expensive vehicle whose job could be performed as well, if not better, by a heavy IV like BMPT 15, or a much cheaper vehicle based on a pre-existing hull, just like Product 183, more widely known as BMPT 72 Terminator 2, showcased in 2013. It dropped using a newly built T90 based chassis for utilizing a pre-existing modernized T72A chassis with the BMPT turret system installed, which significantly reduced costs and made it a much more sensible option. If it became a more sensible vehicle, it perhaps could be partnered up with the relatively recently shown updated BMOT heavy APCs built on converted T72B chassis to create a somewhat logical and relatively cheap heavy duo for supporting tanks, based on pre-existing vehicles. With recent patents regarding the modernization of older T72 tanks utilizing the BMPT turret module in a style similar to BMPT 72 without the AGLs, and appearance of an unmanned module in such style related to TSRK Sturm Heavy Robotic Assault Complex, one could argue that perhaps BMPT will finally become less ridiculous and more useful. However, even then, it will still be limited by just plain stupid autocannon arrangement, which would be best fixed by complete removal of the second gun and return to the original mock-up layout. If the original ideas behind the BMPT concept were upkept, perhaps a much better vehicle would be in service and the internet wouldn't be filled with the massively misunderstood idea behind it.